Today we're talking about keying or adjusting your colors and values in your painting. Today we're going to take a look at how to key or adjust your values and your colors. And what I mean by that is how to get the right relationship with all the values in your painting and all the colors. And that looks like this. Let's take a look at this painting here. It's by Willard Metcalf. Is that when we look at values, we don't tend to relate them with each other. So if I'm standing outside and I'm painting this painting, I'm looking at this scene, and I look at the shadows on the tree in front, I will isolate those shadows and just copy or paint what I see. And then if I look at the shadows back here, the trees in the background, I'll isolate those values and colors and paint what I see. Then the same thing in the middle ground trees, I'll just paint those. And what I'm doing is I'm not relating them to each other and not taking into effect the idea that I'm trying to show depth on a flat surface, or I'm trying to show shadow way in the distance or shadow in the middle ground or foreground. So I have to paint this shadow of the tree in the foreground in relation to the values of the trees in the background, also in relation to the trees in the middle ground. So we can't isolate a value and color and just paint it because we see them too dark or too light. We have to see things in relation to each other. And the same thing with the color. If I'm painting the sunlight on this foliage in the foreground and then just look at the background and paint the sunlight in the background trees, if I'm not relating those two colors, the foreground and background foliage, I'm going to get them too much the same and it'll flatten the painting and it won't have any depth to it. So we need to take in the whole painting, the values and the color, so that the value and color relationships work together. So we're going to take a look at some paintings and talk about how these artists are keying the values and colors and how that works to make the painting have depth and sense of sunlight. So this is Willard Metcalf. He's an American painter, born in 1858 and died in 1925. And he painted very high-key paintings. Not all the time, but a lot of his paintings were. And by that, I mean to achieve the sense of light and airiness and atmosphere, he raised up all the values. Now, he still had the same relationship. In other words, the value relationship between the darks and the lights was still there, still a lot of contrast, but both the darks and the lights are a lot lighter. That's called high-keyed values. Now, low-keyed values are the opposite. You're seeing your light areas dark and your shadows dark. You're bringing down the value relationship. You still have strong contrast, like between the light grass down here and the dark shadow on the building. This is another Willard Metcalf, but it's lower. It's brought down to the lower end of the value scale. And a lot of his paintings, especially later, were very high key. Early on, his paintings were more low-keyed values and colors. So here it's got the shadows are fairly light, some really dark ones, but overall the shadows are a little lighter and the lights are a lot lighter also, so that he can still have the strong value contrast, like between the sunlight, grass, and the shadow on the stone fence. So still a lot of contrast. Everything's just lighter. And by keying the colors, making sure they relate, He's got his more intense colors up here, the sunlit foliage and grass. But then the sunlit foliage in the background is a bit more muted. A little bit of the complement added to it. And not quite as strong, but still lighter than the shadow and warmer and more sunlit looking, but not the same color as is in the foreground. It has to be a little more muted and lighter. So that's very high key. The background, the shadows and the trees in the background, they're all a lot lighter and the color's more muted. But the shadows in the foreground and middle ground are light enough that you can see into them and see a color. Not so here. The shadows are really dark. You don't see the color as much, but the light colors are also darker and you see more color in them. And that's the advantage of a low-key painting where all your values are darker. You're going to get more color in your lights. In a high-key painting, you're adding more white to your lights. So it gets a little bit more washed out. They're not quite as saturated as a low-key painting. And we'll look at both here in a minute. This is another Willard Metcalf, very high-key. The shadows on the tree trunks here are the darkest shadow. And they're fairly dark, but they're still light enough that you can see into them and see a color. I can see what color those tree trunks are. Same thing with the shadow in the background trees, the shadow on the red trees, kind of the violet green shadow on the shrubbery. It's all a lot lighter and you can see into the shadow more. And typically you're going to have high key paintings on a backlit day or a foggy day or dense clouds that make the shadows a lot lighter. But here the light is kind of in front of us. It's backlit. You can see that by the cast shadows here on the foreground. So the shadows are upright and the light is kind of enveloping, wrapping around the shadows, so they get a little bit lighter. I mean, you really can't see the shadows on the yellow-orange foliage on this foreground tree because the light's just wrapping around it. So shadows are lighter, but the lights are a lot lighter also, so that you still have strong contrast, everything being lighter. So more color in the shadows. And the light areas aren't quite as rich because you're having to add white to them to get them lighter. This is another one here. Color is really saturated in front. And then in the background, the color is a lot more muted, a lot more cooler colors added to the warmer colors to mute them. But you can see how saturated these orange trees are. They look almost straight from the tube. But everything is a high key value range. Shadows are lighter, lights are a lot lighter as well. So now here he's dropped it down a little bit, like from this painting. This is very high key. This isn't really a real low key painting, but it's kind of in the middle. So the lights aren't quite as light, so you get more color in the lights. Shadows get a little darker, not quite as colorful. So this is more towards the lower end, but not quite really low like this one. And again, color detail is a little more simplified in the background, not as strong or as saturated as the color in the foreground. So getting the right relationship between the colors in foreground and background to create that sense of depth. This is also kind of a middle ground keyed painting. Shadows are dark, but not so dark that you can't see into them and see a color. It's a definite color into the shadowed green trees. It's not just a dark. And the lights are a little bit darker also, so you get more color in your lights. I tend to paint more low-key because that way I can get more color into my lights. The more you raise the values to a higher key, the less color you're going to get in your lights. And same thing with a really low value. It's a real nice painting. It's great composition, strong contrast, good color. He used a lot of small brush strokes, which looks very detailed. I mean, overly detailed paintings tend to use tiny brush strokes. He uses small brush strokes, but the big shapes still hold together as big, solid masses and shapes. It doesn't have that overly detailed look. Here's another one, a little lower key. You get a lot more color in the lights because you're having the values be a little bit darker in the lights. So a lot more color because they're not washed out with so much white as in that one. And also dark's a little darker, not as much color in some of the shadows because again, the darks are getting darker. Now this big overall shadow, the whole foreground and middle ground's in shadow, but the darker shadows get a lot darker. And if this was high key, these lighter shadows on the hillside and the middle ground would be a lot lighter. And you'd see more color in these shadows here because the shadows would be lighter also. Now here's a rare Willard Metcalf that is a low key. Darks, real dark in and around here. And this could be the photograph of the painting. Sometimes they turn out darker or lighter as well. But you can see the lights aren't that light. They're still the contrast between the shadows because the shadows are so dark. But there's more color in the lights because it's a lower key. So it just helps to be aware that when you're painting your values, you have to relate all the values to each other and then really make a conscious decision. Are all the values going to be slightly lighter than what I see or a little darker? Do I want to move them one way or the other? And if I'm just trying to paint what I see, I still have to be aware of the overall range of values so I can keep them together. Now, Willard Metcalf painted in France a lot, or lived there for a while early on. I don't know if he went to art school there or just painted, but he was aware of Monet and I guess painted with him some, or at least really knew of him. Friend of his son, I've read. He was affected by Monet's colors. That's where the smaller brush strokes and the high key colors came from. And so we look at Monet's paintings. He also painted in a very high key. The more impressionistic he got, the higher key he became. This is one here where you can see the shadows, really light. And then the lights have to be really light also so that he can still have the strong contrast. A lot of reflected light on this cliff. Although the lights in the grass here are fairly dark. They have a lot of color saturation in them. So high or low key, it doesn't always match exactly. This one's a bit more in the middle. So the shadows are darker. Lights are a little darker too, so that you get more color in the lights than on a really high key painting. Just a quick aside, I found this drawing by Monet. We think of Monet as just a bunch of intense color, but man, he could really draw. There's a lot of his drawings on the internet you can look at. And he just saw composition, design really well, and was able to simplify things into simple dark and light patterns. It's a nice drawing. Back to the paintings. Again, kind of a higher key, a lot of color in the shadows because he's keeping the shadows lighter, and not as much color in some of the lights because again, they have to be a lot lighter. So you're having to add more white to the sunlit water, or more white, to make it lighter. And that kills the color slightly. Again, more of a high key. Another one here, it's high key because of all the smoke. Similar to fog. Fog creates more of a high key painting. Shadows in the smoke and on the trains and on the ground here in the foreground, they're a lot lighter, so you can see more color in them. And the lights, while they have a lot of yellow-orange in them, are very, very light. More pale, but warm. Another nice one here. More high key than not. Lights are very light and shadows are lighter also. Now this is an early painting by Monet, and this, of course, is a low key painting because he's got darker shadows. You're not really able to see the color of the shadows, but the lights are a lot darker also because he still wants that contrast between the upright dark trees and the flat sunlit grass. So not as much white in the lights, so you can see more color in it. Same thing with the foliage on the trees, they're darker. But you got to go a lot darker with the shadows to get that same contrast to show the sunlight. And a lot of his earlier paintings are very low-key in value. Now this is Henry Hinch. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. American painter, 1899 to 1992. Was in Massachusetts, Provincetown. Provincetown was an art school, early 20th century. And he was one of the teachers, and very high-key paintings. You got a lot of color in his shadows and painted a lot of backlighting, which gives you a higher key value range. And you can see the shadows have a lot of color, especially in the houses, the white houses. All kinds of color, reflected light bouncing back in there. Same thing with the tree trunks. That would normally be where the darkest darks are in the green foliage, but he's kept them lighter. And he's made the lights a lot lighter yet, more white in them to get the strong contrast between the dark and the light. Sometimes the lights can have just a glare in them, like on the rooftops. It's more just glare than it is showing any color. There's a nice composition there. Did a great job of color in the shadows. Some other painters here. This is Aldro Hibbard, American painter in Massachusetts, painted in Vermont, 1886 to 1972. And more of a low-key value range. Shadows are really dark, still some color in some of them, but the lights are darker also. You can see real strong color, blues and yellows and reds, color in the water. Because it's lower, a lot of the lights don't have a ton of white in them. Now, white objects do, even in low-key painting. White objects and the glare in the sky are going to be really light. But you can get more color even in that really light, glary sky because you've lowered all your values. You don't have to use as much white. This is a painting by Frederick Malhaupt, another Massachusetts painter, Cape Ann, Massachusetts, 1871 to 1938. And more low-key. It's got a lot of color in the lights. He doesn't have to add as much white to the lights because all the values are lower. And same thing with the color. Color's stronger. So you can get a little stronger color in the background, like right in here, because the color in the foreground is going to be stronger yet. So the same thing with the color as with the values. You want the right relationship so that they all work together, either high-keyed or low-keyed. Great job on these trees, using the negative shapes to give a lot of shape to those trees. So another Frederick Malhaupt. Again, everything's darker. You can see how dark the shadows are. Almost no color in them, which means his lights are a lot darker also, and he can get a lot of color in those. Really strong color in the lights, and then the dark's a lot darker. So painting by Sidney Long. He's an Australian painter. And again, very low-key. Now, the sky is very light. The Australian painters really had a lot of strong contrast in their painting. Whether their painting was a high-key or low-key, they always had strong contrast. So really dark in these trees, in the shadows. Shadows are very dark. Lights can be darker also, not as much white. And here is color. He's almost got more of a bluish color scheme. Blue is into everything. He's not as worried about local color, but color is a lot stronger in the foreground, and to create the colors to recede has them a bit more muted in the background. So more of a dark, low-key, but a lot of high contrast. Usually don't have as much high contrast on a low-key painting. Now this is Daniel Garber. And again, we're looking at a backlit scene, which when you're looking right into the sun like that, the sunlight kind of wraps around the shadows and makes them lighter. And it really sets up a high-key value and color situation. So the lights here, they have so much white in them, they don't have as much color. But the shadows, they're a lot lighter, so he can get a lot more color in the shadows. So high-key paintings or high-keyed values really set up a strong backlit scene like that. Still has a lot of cool and warm temperature, but it's the values that are a lot lighter. This one a little more in the middle. Darks are darker, not as much color in them. Lights are a lot darker too and have more color in them because there's that white doesn't kill the color. Daniel Garber is also one that uses a lot of small brush strokes. So another Garber, again, more of a low key. The lights have a lot of color in them because the value is darker. And the shadows, not as much. You can definitely see the color in the shadow, so it's not really strong low key, but still good contrast between the dark and the light. Everything's just lower on the value scale. Color relationship wise, there's not as much depth, so there's not as much variation of foreground and background because it's not showing a lot of depth there. Beautiful color relationships in there. Last one here, Sydney Long, also, again, Australian. More low-key, shadows very dark, so the light middle ground here has more color in it. It just jumps a little bit more. Still has the stronger color in the foreground. So relationship-wise, he's muting the colors compared to the foreground a bit more in the background. But low-key with stronger color in the light. So low-key values, high-key values. Low-key is just all the values get darker equally, and a high-key, all the values get lighter equally. And there's advantages to both. Same thing with color relationships. You want to key your colors to where you're stronger, more saturated colors in the foreground, and then make sure the colors in the background stay back there by making them a bit more muted.